Hello and welcome back. The next thing that I will add to my ship is some flight controls so that we can move it around the screen. And we're going to need an FSM to do this. So on my player ship, I will select it, and then I need to add another FSM. One way that I can do this is simply right-click in the editor window and go down to Add FSM Component, and then select New FSM. Another way that I could do this is in the actual editor window, the Object dropdown has a Add FSM to Player Ship button, and so does the FSM dropdown. So either way that we do that, that is fine. Then I will name this FSM something like maybe Flight Controls. And I will name State 1 Controlling Ship. Currently this is not doing anything. We've just set up the naming conventions for it. And we're going to use key input from the keyboard to decide our ship's movement of left, right, up, and down. And we have to be careful when we use key input that we stay within a single state. If I were to say press down the A key and have it leave this state and go to another state to move left, I would then need that state also listening for all the key inputs, because it would make it possible, if it wasn't, for it to get stuck in state 2 and not make it back to state 1, which is something that we refer to as state lock. So I want to make sure that all of my controls happen right inside this one FSM and that they're happening constantly every frame. The way that we're going to do this is no matter what direction my camera looks at the world, the camera has an X and a Y axis. And Unity keeps track of these automatically for us in the background. If we go to the Edit menu, down to Project Settings, and then over to Input, you can actually see a list of axes that exist in Unity. We have one called Horizontal, which is the X direction of our camera. And it is automatically looking for the left and right arrow keys, or the A and the D key. I also have one down here called Vertical, and it is referring to the Y direction of the camera space. It has a negative button of the down arrow key and the up arrow keys, as well as the S key and the W key. So we have W, A, S, and D, the WASD keys, or the arrow keys. And these are always being mapped for us in the background. So back on the FSM, where I'm controlling my ship, I will add an action of get access, and it's obviously the last one I used. It's right here at the top of the list, so I'm going to double click on that, and I actually need it twice. I need once for my horizontal access, and I need once for my vertical access. At the top of the action, it asks for the access name, and this has to be spelled with a capital and be spelled correctly. It has to match the name in the input settings. So I will type in capital H for horizontal and capital V for vertical. And then I need to store these. So I will say new variable and call the first one h-axis, and I will name the vertical new variable v-axis, just so I can tell them apart. And if I have debug on and hit play, what we're going to see happen here is if I use my A and D keys, my horizontal access will go from 0 to 1 or 0 to -1. And if I use my W key, it will go in vertical to +1. And if I use the S key, it goes to -1. And the same is true with my arrow keys. You can see that the values are scrolling up and down, left, right. And this is great. I'm now getting input as to the direction that I am pressing the key. But one thing that you will notice is that it snaps back to 0. The reason that this is happening, if we look in the settings again for our inputs, there's 3 things we want to pay attention to. We have this gravity setting, we have a dead setting, and we have a sensitivity setting. The gravity setting decides how fast do I return back to 0. So the lower this number, the longer it takes. The higher the number, the faster it gets back to that 0 point. The dead zone decides how accurately we need to be at 0 before the input stops reading up, down, left, or right. And then the sensitivity is how fast do we input the signal. So the lower this number, the longer it takes to go from 0 to positive or -1. And the higher this number, the faster it gets to that value. If I uncheck snap, it won't return back to 0. And I could actually modify the input right here and not have it return to 0. And the reason that I may consider doing that is right now, if I was to map this horizontal axis to the ship directly and tell it to set the position, I could fly left, but then when I let go, he would return back to 0. But instead of messing with the input settings, I'm going to do this inside of my FSM. So I want to get this access every frame, both the horizontal and the vertical. And once we have that information, we need to accumulate it in a variable that will not snap back to 0. So I will add an action of float add. When we press left or right, up or down, we're getting a 0 to 1 in decimal numbers, which means we are dealing with a float number as opposed to an integer or something like that. I want to float add whatever the value of horizontal is into a container that can accumulate up or down as the game continues. So I will make a new container, and I will call this something like H aggregate maybe, or accumulated. So I'll just call it HAG for short. You could call it H total. This is the value that we are going to store information into. I need to do this for my vertical value as well, so I will copy and paste this action. And then this variable I will call my V aggregate, or you can name it appropriately to match however you chose. What I want to do is I want to add to my H aggregate a certain value. Well, you're currently seeing that my add is in constant mode. It is looking for me to input a hard-coded value. If I select the parallel line button on the far right, this is a toggle for whether I would like to use a variable or I would like to use a constant. So I will toggle it to use a variable. And I want to add whatever is being found in this H axis. I want to add it to my H aggregate. And then I'm going to do the same for my V aggregate. So I will switch it to variable mode and tell it to take the V axis and store it into my V aggregate. We need this to happen every frame per second. So I'm going to hit play and explain how this works. And I'm going to minimize this vertical and move my float add up so that you can see it next to itself. This get access is only ever going to go up to 1 or down to -1. But my aggregate is going to add +1 per frame every second. So if I hold the right key, notice that my float aggregate increases. When I let go, H access returns to 0. So it's adding 0 to this number per second every frame. If I start pressing left, I now have a negative number. And so I am adding -1 to this number per second every frame. And so I'm actually able to accumulate a value negatively or positively if I'm pressing up and down in my vertical aggregate or my horizontal aggregate. Since these values are not snapping back to 0, I can use them to set the position of my ship. So I'm going to minimize some of this to clean it up a little bit. So I'm going to minimize my get accesses and my float adds since I know that they're working. Once I get this input and get it stored, I can use that number to position my ship on the screen, whether it's left, right, up, or down. However, I don't want it to leave the screen. So if I move my ship over to the edge of my screen, let me expand this a little bit so you can see it, about -17.3.5, somewhere in there, that's the max distance that I want my ship to move left before I have left the screen. Now this number might be different in your build. It's going to be determined by the size of the scene that you built, but also by the distance the camera is, and if you are using orthographic, the size of your orthographic projection. The number itself doesn't actually matter. What matters is that your player ship gets to the edge and stops. Currently, my float add does not have a stopping point. It's going to allow me to just keep accumulating a number left or right, up or down, and it's going to just keep getting bigger and smaller. So I need to tell it to stop. And the way that we do that is with a clamp. So I will type in the word clamp. And since we are using a float variable, I need to use a float clamp. I need this to happen twice. Once for the horizontal axis and once for the vertical axis. The value that we want to clamp is the aggregate value. So my H aggregate, I need a minimum and a maximum. Well, if we look at my ship, minus 17.3 and positive 17.3, give or take, is about the max I want my ship to move. So in my minimum, I will say minus 17.3, and in my maximum, I will say positive 17.3. And I need this to happen every frame. Then if I take my ship and drag it up to the top of my screen or to the bottom of my screen, I'm going to get about 9.5. So my vertical aggregate, I will clamp, and the minimum here will be minus 9.5, and the positive value will be 9.5 every frame. So what I'm telling this is get this access every frame, store it into an aggregate, and then clamp that aggregate so it can never get any bigger or smaller than these numbers. It will continually try and add, but if we get outside of this context, the numbers will stop. And to make sure that this is working, I will hit play. And we can look in the float clamp value as I press left or right. Eventually this number will get all the way to 17.3. Now, if I'm thinking about the fact that my ship was in the middle and I'm moving right, I'm about halfway at this point. Now I'm about 10 and 12, 13, 14, 15. We're getting to the edge. I finally hit the edge and it stopped. Okay, but that took a long time to go from the center point to the edge. So we also need to decide how fast I want my ship to move across these distances. So I'm going to stop the game and I'll minimize my float adds and my float clamps since I know that those are working. I'm going to take the ship and just set it back to 0 really quick so it's back in the center of my screen. Under the get access, we have a multiplier. My axis never gets any bigger or smaller than -1, +1, and since I'm multiplying by 1, that's the biggest number that I can store per frame. However, if I were to type in 10 here, I'm now multiplying by 10, and my value is going to increase significantly faster. Instead of hard coding this with a value, I'm going to add a variable. So I will click on the toggle and then say new variable, and I will call this variable ship speed. And anytime we make a new variable, if we look in the variables tab, it's typically going to come in without a value. So I'm going to give it a speed of 20 for now. I don't know if that's too fast or too slow. And then I'm going to check it to the inspector so that over here in my flight controls, I now have a value of ship speed that I can adjust. I need to tell my get access horizontal to multiply by ship speed and then store. And then I will tell my get access vertical to multiply by ship speed. So I will toggle and tell it to use ship speed, and then input these to my float add and clamps. So now if I watch one of these aggregates and we hit play, I will scroll up and down in position much faster. It only takes about a second now to go completely from the center of the screen to the clamped area. So let's get this applied to the ship and see how fast the ship actually moves. We are going to use an action of set position. Since I physically moved the ship across the screen to get these values, I can set the ship's position to these clamped values every frame. So my ship's X is going to be whatever is stored into my H aggregate. And since my camera is looking down on the world, I want my ship Z to be the direction that the input of vertical is controlling. So I will tell my ship's Z space to take whatever is in my vertical aggregate. And then as far as our Y is concerned, we don't want it to be changed at all. We could leave that to none. I could click and set it to 0. But if we look back at our player ship, in its rigid body, we actually have Y frozen. So this isn't really going to help us much down here. So I want to be setting my ship to these positions, and I want to happen every frame so that we stay in this loop constantly. So now if I hit play, let it load, I should be able to still aim my ship. Cursor is hidden and we've got a new icon. If I press left, I can fly left and I can fly right. Notice the ship stays aimed. When I get to the edge of the screen, the ship will stop. I can fly to the top and it will stop. And at this point I could decide whether this ship is too slow or too fast. And I can change that with a variable out here called ship speed. So I think I'll turn it up to maybe 30. Give it one last quick test. So now I've got a little bit faster, more responsive ship. And we could always come back and play with these values later. Ship is now working awesome. We can aim it and we can fly it. So we're about ready to get this thing shooting some projectiles and getting a collision sequence on it for our enemies. Okay, we'll continue on in the next one. So I want to make sure that all of my controls happen right inside this one FSM.